Hey, good afternoon. My name is Professor Regine Jean-Charles, and I'm an assistant professor of Romance Languages and Literatures and African Diaspora Studies. I want to welcome all of you to the first lecture of the spring semester of our series, which began in the fall. Our lecture series is called New Directions in African Diaspora Studies, and the theme for this year is intersectionality. I ask that you please now take this time to turn off anything you have that makes noise, your cell phones, your Fitbits, anything noisy. So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Sawika Diggs-Colbert, who is an associate professor of African American Studies and Theater and Performance Studies at Georgetown University. As her work demonstrates, Professor Colbert has contributed significantly to her fields of African American literary studies, theater studies, and performance studies. She is the author of The African American Theatrical Body, Reception, Performance, and the Stage, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2011. She is also the editor of the Black Performance Special Issue of African American Review in 2012. She's currently working on a second book project entitled Black Movements, Performance, and Politics, and an edited volume entitled Do You Want to Be Well? The Psychic Hold of Slavery. She has published articles in African American Review, Theater Journal, Boundary 2, South Atlantic Quarterly, and Theater Topics, and in collections Black Performance Theory, Contemporary African American Women Playwrights, and August Wilson Completing the Cycle. Through this impressive body of work, she has intervened in some of the most exciting and helped to generate some of the most exciting conversations in the field of African American literary and cultural studies, each time arguing for the centrality of Black performance and new modes of reading. She's the recipient of the Woodrow Wilson Foundation Career Enhancement Fellowship, the Stanford Humanities Postdoctoral Fellowship, the Mellon Summer Research Grant, and the Robert W. Woodruff Library Fellowship. Her research interests span the 19th and 21st through 21st centuries, from Harriet Tubman to Beyonce, and from poetics to performance. I have also had the pleasure of having Professor Colbert as a friend and colleague for several years. She is a deep and thorough thinker, committed to asking rigorous questions and positing innovative ways of looking at a range of topics. Sawika interrogates every text presented to her with precision and energy that is quite simply astounding at times. The dynamism of her critical mind is paired with wit, honesty, and warmth that I think are also reflected in her work and in how she lives her life. These qualities make her not only a superb academic, but also a wonderful person. So please join me in welcoming her.
That was sweet. That was very sweet. Where should I put this?
There's a stand-up.
Oh, yeah, you can pass.
Oh, thank you. And I probably won't drink any of this, so this is much to do about nothing.
How does it come out?
Oh, that's all right, don't worry.
No, it does come out, though.
All right, so.
Okay, sorry. It does come out, though.
So I have a little bit of a cold, so if I have to duck down to grab the water, just pretend like it's part of the show. So thank you for having me. I want to thank Richard Paul for arranging my travel. I was just marveling at his efficiency and his organization. It has been so impressive and such a seamless travel here today. So I want to thank you, and as well as the African Diaspora Studies program for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here at BC and to be in conversation with you. So I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about how the center of the talk relates to some ongoing work that I'm doing, and then I'm going to end by hopefully making a connection between Hansberry's work and the contemporary moment. So this talk emerges out of two book projects that are entering their final stages. The first, my second monograph, entitled Black Movements, Performance, and Politics, which contends that the pull of liberal individualism on Black people intensifies in the post-Jim and Jane Crow era, and that the victories of the civil rights movement enabled Black people to occupy social, educational, and professional spaces unavailable to them during segregation. Scientific advancements also contribute to the transformation of racial categories in the late 20th century. But my focus is on how social and cultural practices inform, intersect, and reflect political ones. As a result of shifting understandings of Blackness and changes in the apparatus that regulate Black people by the end of the 20th century, Blackness begins to appear as a chosen affiliation rather than a biological inheritance. And so my presumption is that that is the central shift in how race, and particularly Blackness, operates after the civil rights movement, from a biological inheritance to a chosen affiliation. Black movements examines the ways artists and activists have explicitly and implicitly linked their actions to prior enactments to create what I call webs of affiliation, in order to combat, and in certain cases foster, anti-Black racism. I argue that the post-civil rights movement era provides artists and activists greater flexibility in shaping their relationship to Blackness and how it functions and relates to categories of the human and the citizen, which distinguishes the function of Blackness in the late 20th and early 21st century from how it worked in other eras. Black movements then serves a historiographic purpose, activated when artists actively engage with certain pasts and jettison others in order to remember and revive political movements that seem to have stalled. These moments of engagement create webs of affiliation, and throughout Black movements, they occur through speech acts, oral expression, mimicry, disarticulation, and disruption. So I'm not going to talk about every slide, but this one I think offers a visual representation of what I'm trying to achieve in Black movements, because it overlays two gestures that arguably are distinctive and singular in their performance, but I would suggest in Black movements create a line of affiliation between a prior moment, the Black Power movement period, 1968, and our current historical moment via the Hands Up with Ferguson. So we can talk more about this, but I think that this offers, as I said, a visual representation of some of the things I'm trying to get at in Black movements. So the majority of the text of this talk comes from the third chapter of Black movements, but as I prepared the remarks for today, I realized the ways an edited collection entitled The Psychic Code of Slavery that my co-editors and I just sent for review also informs my thinking about Hansberry. The original title of the volume, Do You Want to Be Well, The Psychic Code of Slavery, references the first line of Toni K. Bambara's novel, The Salt Eaters. Bambara's novel begins, "Are you sure, sweetheart, that you want to be well?" Her novel features a main character, Velma Henry, who attempts to commit suicide after participating in some of the leftist movements of the mid-20th century. The specific past of the civil rights and women's movement haunt Bambara's character. To a great extent, the urgent preoccupation with history in the writings of Black women in the 1970s and 80s registered alarm at the potential loss of a history that had never been accurately recorded. The late 20th century Black women writers' renaissance that emerged in relationship to third wave feminism and Black power movements beginning with the 1970 publication of Toni Morrison's Bluest Eye and Alice Walker's The Third Life of Grange Copeland, sought to recuperate partially documented history. The resurgent interest in the slave past can be traced to the late 1960s, but it was the 1987 publication of Morrison's Beloved that established the spectral nature of history, of the history of slavery as the primary political and epistemological feature of cross-disciplinary African American studies. Morrison posited that exorcising the national ghost of slavery required working through painful histories with no promise of repair. Engaging with traumatic past signaled a realization of the psychic and not just juridical hold of slavery. Morrison's novel and the vast literature it inspired presumed that the revelatory power of intellectual engagement would enable a fuller experience of citizenship. One could also understand engaging with the ghosts of history as part of the ongoing abolitionist project. Drawing overlap with late 20th century projects that seek to understand the power relations that produce anti-Blackness, the Psychic Code of Slavery animates a conversation at the heart of Black studies today. How to imagine a political future that responds to anti-Black racism in the present as a feature of a long history of Black domination. The intrusive force of the past informs the present and future in our formulation, suggesting time works in a contrapuntal fashion rather than a linear one. To understand the time of abolition, if time works in a contrapuntal fashion, requires understanding abolition not just as a juridical fiat, but also a psychic and social process elaborated in time. In the often quoted moment from Stephen Best and Saidiya Hartman's Fugitive Justice, they define abolition as an incomplete, future-oriented project. They contend that a justice project, quote, on behalf of the slave, the stateless, the socially dead, and the disposable, end quote, takes place in the political present. They clarify that, imposing the question of slavery in terms of the incomplete nature of abolition, we are concerned neither with what happened then, nor what is owed because of what happened then, but rather with the contemporary predicament of freedom, with the melancholy recognition of foreseeable futures still tethered to the past. Critics, including myself, read Fugitive Justice as an assertion of the ongoing impact of transatlantic slavery in the 21st century. But Hartman and Best do not confine the past, which the contemporary predicament of freedom remains tethered to, transatlantic slavery. The authors beg for consideration of how political projects in the present may address contemporary manifestations of slavery. Certainly the use of the word slave and abolition beg for association with transatlantic slavery, a connection that would not be lost on Best and Hartman. Nevertheless, the language of Fugitive Justice invites abolitionist projects that rethink what past structure the formation of contemporary experiences of statelessness, social death, and disposability. Implicitly, the structuring of the argument in Best and Hartman's essay also asks for consideration of how holding on to certain pasts also undercuts justice movements. So today I would like to take some time to consider how the social justice movements of Hansberry's era inform the contemporary predicament of freedom, keeping in mind the ways Hansberry struggled to be well. As Lorraine Hansberry lay in a hospital bed dying of pancreatic cancer, she edited her last plays. The personal crisis Hansberry faced as she finished LeBlanc evoked in her an uncharacteristic expression of despair. On June 17, 1964, she wrote, "Having the feeling I should throw myself back into the movement, become a human being again. But that very impulse is immediately flushed with 1,000 vacillations and forbidding images. I see myself lying in a pool of perspiration in a dark tenement room, recalling Croton and the trees and longing for death. Comfort has come to be its own corruption. I think of lying without a painkiller in pain. And all of the young years, no such image ever occurred to me. I rather looked forward to going to jail once. Now I can hardly imagine surviving it at all. Comfort. Apparently I have sold my soul for it. I think when I get my health back, I shall go into the South to find out what kind of revolutionary I am." Her meditation is found in a diary entry included in To Be Young, Gifted, and Black, an informal autobiography that Hansberry's ex-husband and literary executor Robert Nimroff compiled after her death. The meditation begins with longing for purpose. Her tone suggests the all-consuming nature of what Hansberry calls the movement and the way it fed her understanding of what it means to be human. Hansberry understood being human as an act of will, a choice undertaken in resistance to chaos. This daily choice acknowledges chaos as an alternative that furtively lays in wait for the battered, bruised, and exhausted. Ravaged by disease and encumbered by her fear of hospitals, Hansberry depicts political action as a persistent personal struggle that serves a meaningful purpose only when understood as part of a long history of struggle for freedom. Hansberry's conception of individual actions being the building blocks of a movement demonstrates how structural reform and individual action become intertwined to build, sustain, and reform institutions. In her meditation, she longs for rest and the ability to welcome death. But in her weary state, she can imagine only giving herself fully over to the pain. Her inability to rest, even in her darkest hours, powerfully signifies the nature of her artistic vision. Because even as she laments the loss of her fearlessness and decries the seduction of comfort, she emphatically concludes, "I think when I get my health back, I shall go into the South to find out what kind of revolutionary I am. Her diary entry provides insight into the relationship between her artistic vision and the actions that maintain and further Black freedom movements, suggesting arts provides the space to invent alternative socialities. At the same time, her expression of pain calls attention to the tragic circumstances of her death and the vacancy left in her unfinished work. Hansberry's play LeBlanc is a powerful expression of audacious dreaming in the midst of despair, of great hope in a season of sorrow. LeBlanc, set in the fictional African country Zatembe, depicts three brothers, Abiose Jr., Shimbe, and Eric, struggling to come to terms with the revolutionary legacy their father, Abiose Sr., left them. Although the play reveals their father's role in the struggle for the native population to take control of the government from the settlers, as children, the sons see Abiose Sr. as a communal leader, working with the settlers, and in their early adult lives as a defeated man. His status gives the two older sons, Abiose and Shimbe, access to the privileges the missionary provides, including formal education. At the beginning of the play, Abiose and Shimbe return from Europe for their father's funeral. Similar to William Shakespeare's Hamlet, the father's death produces a ghost, but not the father's ghost. Rather, Abiose Sr. leaves behind a ghost of the revolutionary spirit that he embodied as the leader of his village and one of the first advocates for self-rule. Conflicted about the status of the government upon his return, Shimbe spends most of the play talking about the insurgency that threatens to topple the government, while the revolutionary spirit haunts him and causes him to question his longing to be in a dim little flat off Langley Square, watching the telly with his family. After pages of talking, the futility of diplomacy confronts Shimbe, and he must make the decision of fleeing to Europe or taking up arms. After an anguished cry, Shimbe chooses. He decides to fight, enacting his first blow for independence on his brother, Abiose. So this is from, as you see, the BU production. And so the three brothers are triangulated. And so Shimbe is this figure. And so Shimbe is sort of the moderate. And his brother, Abiose Sr., is the most conservative. And so when Shimbe decides that he's going to participate in the revolution, he ends up killing his older brother as his first act on the part of the revolution. Early in the play, Shimbe suggests that choice unhinges the actor from history. In describing his decision to move to Europe and marry a white woman with gray eyes, he concludes that he chose freely and it was all over with me in history. Referencing Albert Camus and the absurdist tradition, LeBlanc questions Shimbe establishing his individualism as a free man in that he chose. The play, however, complicates the relationship among choice, history, and individualism by offering characters with seemingly incongruent aspects of their subjectivity. While Shimbe is African, the influence of the mission and his Western education challenge him to negotiate the competing desires of colonial rule and the independence movement. The characterization of Shimbe emphasizes how all acts have histories that constitute the subject, even though the central character has bought into the promise of liberal individualism. In Cities of the Dead, Joseph Roach defines the process of surrogation as how cultures reproduce and recreate themselves. He argues, in the life of a community, the process of surrogation does not begin or end, but continues as actual or perceived vacancies occur in the network of relations that constitute the social fabric. Into the cavities created by loss, through death, or other forms of departure, survivors attempt to fit satisfactory alternatives. Because collective memory works selectively, imaginatively, and often perversely, surrogation rarely, if ever, succeeds. The process requires many trials and at least as many errors. The fit cannot be exact. The intended substitute either cannot fulfill expectations, creating deficit, or actually exceeds them, creating a surplus. Roach's theory of surrogation historicizes and serves as a corrective to conceptions of self-determined individualism that privilege choice. The play suggests that all choices exist within a historical context that influences the individual. Shimbe's impossible position, teetering between violent and nonviolent action, mirrors the untenable situation Hansberry faced at the end of her short life. Confronting the limitations of the civil rights movement and her impending death. Similar to Shimbe, Hansberry was born with relative privilege and a legacy of familial activism. As a child, her father, Carl A. Hansberry, filed a famous lawsuit against housing discrimination that won a battle over restrictive covenants with the Supreme Court, only to lose the war. Although unsuccessful at forcing housing desegregation, Hansberry's father and uncle, the famous Africanist Leo Hansberry, provided examples of how the courts and the written word serve as weapons in the fight for social justice. After completing her second year at the University of Wisconsin, Hansberry left college to pursue a less conventional education. She moved to New York City and began to work with Paul Robeson on the journal Freedom. Though one might easily predict Hansberry's activism based on her upbringing, I argue that the form it takes, an unyielding resistance to nihilism and an unwavering commitment to human life, specifies the power of her artistic vision. In the play, Shinbei's decision to stay and fight reflects a choice to defy the power of death and to command the force of history. Instead of conceding to the random absurdity of life, Hansberry's play depicts how Shinbei's political consciousness emerges through his choice to further the independence movement of his father. Although Shinbei acknowledges that he would rather enjoy the escapism that his colonial and Western education provides him access to as an expatriate that lives in Europe before returning to his native country for his father's funeral, by play's end he chooses to participate in the struggle for independence. Shinbei's actions disrupt the life in Europe that his missionary education affords him and harnesses the historically disruptive ghostly force of revolution. The cry that precipitates Shinbei's choice to join the revolution expresses hope in the midst of sorrow. The sound also marks the agony of killing one's brother in the name of the nation. Shinbei must decide to align himself with certain traditions and sever ties with other ones. His practice of affiliation and disaffiliation maps along familial national lines. The cry marks the cut and the suture. But what are the implications of political action, of understanding the cries expressed in the play as defeat and triumph in the face of absurdity? The simple question sets up a dynamic reconsideration of Black radical historiography for a Black woman artist activist operating in the waning years of the Civil Rights Movement and post-colonial movement period, through its analysis of desired outcomes in the relationship of practice and remembering. The particular action of the play's protagonist demonstrates a political theory that refuses the individual autonomy of Western democratic citizenship and rather calls attention to Black internationalism as a practice that, according to Penny Von Eschen, linked African Americans with Africa and the Caribbean, not because they were biological blood ties, but because their different experiences of slavery and colonialism were all seen as part of the history of the expansion of Europe and the development of capitalism. While the abstract geography of the play runs the risk of generalizing particular national and local traditions, the setting also calls attention to a variety of independence movements, which reinvigorates Black freedom movements by creating what I call webs of affiliation. Webs of affiliation connect performances in the present to those enacted in the past that may otherwise go unnoticed and secure them as historical, creating a backward glance that enacts a future vision. Webs of affiliation propel freedom movements that seem to have stalled because the practices of affiliation and disaffiliation enable individuals to participate in structural critique, and in so doing implicitly rework notions of liberal individualism. I argue that the cry explored in this talk creates modes of affiliation through disarticulation that trouble the legibility of the postcolonial subject within the context of liberal subjectivity. The webs emerge through practices that do not suggest continuity, but connection that surrogation produces. The connection calls attention to similarities in power, social, and economic dynamics, as well as historical specificity that contextualize their enactment. The cry expressed in the turning point of LeBlanc disrupts the primacy of the verbal over the bodily, and alternatively integrates the two, language and articulation, sound and disarticulation, offering an understanding of the human predicated on the mutual constitution of writing and oral expression. The play communicates a politics that necessarily requires theory and action as theory. Imagining a future in the midst of a post-colonial quagmire, the cry troubles the epistemological hold that grips post-colonial subjects, a hold that urges them to reproduce the structure of colonial dominance. Cries for freedom express political subjectivity and demonstrate the power of the voice to disrupt egalitarian notions of political agency. Amy Césaire's post-colonial dramas A Tempest, an adaptation of Shakespeare's The Tempest, serves as the basis for theories of political agency for the Black post-colonial subject. Césaire's A Tempest stages a battle for control of a yet unborn empire. Caliban, the insurgent, humorous, irreverent slave, and Prospero, the waspish, arrogant former Duke of Milan, fight for control of the island where the play is set. Early on, Caliban declares an independence movement. His insurgent cries for freedom declare his claim of sovereignty. In a reading of Césaire's play, Anthony Bogues claims that when Caliban casts off the name and cloak of Caliban, he ceases to exist. Bogues pinpoints Caliban's unresponsive iteration of Huru and his subsequent insistence that Prospero call him X, as acts that break the hold of the discursive regimes that lock Caliban in the position of a slave. Bogues suggests that Caliban's cry establishes him as a political subject unbound from the language that oppressed him. Referencing Bogues' queries, if words and language are the mechanisms by which intellectuals organize their practices, then in an anti-Black society and colonial context, what is the political language they should speak? Though there is a long history in Black literary and political theory that considers the implications of naming for the Black subject, Bogues' use of phenom points us in a different direction, away from questions of individual subjectivity to a consideration of how the spoken word functions as a fundamental component of political movements and serves to constitute the speaker as a political subject. The cries for freedom in A Tempest and LeBlanc establish a central figure as a political subject, drawing from multiple and cultural traditions. Cries produce gaps in colonial models of social organization, which enable the Black diasporic subject to appear and disappear, and highlight the limits of discursive practice as a mechanism for political uplift in the absence of action. Shimbei's choice to stay and fight for independence exemplifies the crossroads of the U.S. civil rights movement and international movements for independence in the mid and late 20th century, particularly the one taking place in Kenya, which most closely mirrors the developments in LeBlanc. Hansberry's character exhibits a resolve that addresses the political ups and downs that marked the civil rights movement, from the March on Washington on August 28, 1963, to the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church on September 15, 1963. So whenever I teach about the civil rights movement, particularly during Black History Month, I often remind my students that we celebrate the March on Washington, which was August 28, 1963, but we often forget that just days later, on September 15th, was the 16th Street Church bombing. And so when we're remembering the civil rights movement, sometimes we can disentangle the victories from the violence that was going on. And so I like to draw my students to the attention to the fact that during the movement, there was this perpetual sense of bloodshed that was ongoing, that was coupling these moments of great triumph that we celebrate in the aftermath. And that's part of what's informing Hansberry's vision at the time, the coupling of these moments of possibility, hope, and the shrouding of despair when she's seeing all this bloodshed. And so similarly, the struggle for independence in Kenya, from Jomo Kenyatta's imprisonment in 1952 to Kenya's independence in 1963. LeBlanc depicts the cost of Shimbei's final decision in the play to kill his brother, affirming a vision of self and collective determination that required severing a familial tie. Margaret Wilkerson's essay, The Sighted Eyes and Feeling Heart of Lorraine Hansberry, informs my understanding of the nature of Hansberry's activist aesthetic. Wilkerson argues, Hansberry's sighted eyes forced her to confront fully the depravity, cruelty, and utter foolishness of men's actions, but her feeling heart would not allow her to lose faith in humanity's potential for overcoming its own barbarity. This strong and uncompromising belief in the future of humankind informed her plays and sometimes infuriated her critics. Hansberry characterized the movement as a struggle for human and civil rights, gender equality, and peace. The movement sought to demonstrate that, according to Hansberry, all human questions overlap. Men continue to misinterpret the second-rate status of women as implying a privileged status for themselves. Heterosexuals think the same way about homosexuals, Gentiles about Jews, whites about blacks, haves about have-nots, and then always come the reckoning. Hansberry's play offers a nuanced political point of view that resists the patriarchal privilege implicit in much of the rhetoric of the civil rights movement and Black power movements, and it also foregrounds the fluidity and inconsistency of social change. For example, Hansberry's most well-known play, A Raising the Sun, ends without a resolution and with only the promise of continual struggle. So how many of you have seen A Raising the Sun? Okay, most of you, good. So for those of you who haven't, it's Black History Month. And I would suggest the 1961 version rather than the more contemporary one. The movie, so the play was on Broadway in 1959, and then in 1961, the same cast did a movie of the play. So in Raising the Sun, the Younger family purchases a home in a segregated community after being warned of by the residents of the community of the resistance to their move. The final scene of A Raising the Sun, a scene that in an earlier version of the play featured the Younger family sitting in the living room of their new home with shotguns, qualifies as at least ambivalent, or as Hansberry would put it, between despair and joy. And so in the final scene, you see the Youngers moving, them taking all their things and packing to go. But what's interesting is, as they're leaving, they're going to a segregated community that doesn't want them and where there's been violence. And so they're realizing their dream of moving into a home, from an apartment into a home, but that dream is sort of shrouded in the ambiguity of whether or not they're going to meet violence in this new community or not. Similarly, LeBlanc ends moments after the insurgents bomb the missionary hospital and kill the matriarch of the settler community. Loose ends, to say the least. The incompleteness of the action draws attention to the open-endedness of the struggle and opportunity to impose the reason for life on life. Hansberry, like others, was aware of the shortcomings of the movement and the pretending violence. The Watts riots began months after Hansberry's death. So the Watts riots are in August 65. Hansberry dies in January 1965. In the Black Revolution and the White Backlash, a speech Hansberry gave June 15, 1964, she offers biographic evidence to explain her ethical ambiguity regarding diplomacy versus direct action. Recalling her father's struggle against restrictive housing covenants in Chicago, Hansberry noted his unwavering commitment to social justice, fighting the case in the courts all the way to the Supreme Court. Yet Chicago remains a segregated city, and her father died a disillusioned exile in another country. With the complicated legacy of her father as a backdrop, Hansberry asserts, "That is the reality that I'm faced with when I get up and I read that some Negroes my own age and younger say that we must now lie down in the streets, tie up traffic, stop ambulances, do whatever we can, take to the hills if necessary with some guns and fight back, you see. This is the difference." Through the distinction between physical resistance and civil disobedience began to mark the end of the civil rights movement. In the summer of 1964, Hansberry's work expresses the radical difference as an abiding and necessary part of her consciousness, meaning Carl Hansberry's life served as a preface to the civil rights movement for Hansberry that introduced the abiding force of despair. Given her introduction to freedom movements, her vision to impose the reason for life on life functioned as a pragmatic politics of hope. So the case, the Supreme Court case that her father's involved with is in 1940. And a lot of the historiography of the civil rights movement, we often understand it as this moment of utopian visions of remaking the world. And in 1964 and 1965, we see this vision shifting and waning, it becoming more pragmatic, there being this notion of direct action versus civil disobedience. There's this shift that takes place. So part of what I'm trying to suggest, and that vision of that narrative of the civil rights movement flattens out what really happened, but that's part of the narrative. But part of what I want to suggest is that Hansberry, having seen what happened to her father, already understood that coupling from the 40s well into when she started working with Robeson in the 50s. The final scene of LeBlanc, following Abbey Osage Jr.'s death and the bombing of the missionary hospital, features Shinbei alone on stage emitting an animal-like cry of grief, which marks the necessary human cost of social change. The play does not advocate for martyrdom, but instead inserts an even deeper awareness of human interconnection, ascribing an animal sound to the sound of Shinbei's voice. Blurring the line between human and animal sounds, between the expression of human and animal suffering, the play calls attention to the porous distinction between animal and human and the difficult choices one must make in a moment of crisis to resist chaos and express a singularity that Hansberry ascribes to humanity. She writes, "Man is unique in the universe, the only creature who has, in fact, the power to transform the universe." Shinbei's cry echoes the foreboding promise of the Nigerian student Asagai from Hansberry's A Raising the Sun, who warns, "Perhaps the thing I believe now for my country will be wrong and outmoded, and I will not understand and do terrible things to have things my way or merely to keep my power. Don't you see that there will be young men and women, not British soldiers then, but my own black countrymen, to step out of the shadow some evening and slit my then useless throat? Don't you see they have always been there, that they will always be? and that such a thing as my own death will be an advance. They who might kill me even actually replenish all that I was. Just as Asagai assures his love interest beneath it that his potential death will be an advance, as a part of what has always been there, Shinbei's cry calls forth a historical connection that does not specify direction, but that ties him to the insurgency of his father and what is yet to come. At the same time, his cry signals a painful splintering of the social fabric that threatens his humanity as it enables a redirection of the course of history. The play communicates this redirection, instructing that the woman appears in a pool of light as Shinbei cries. The female dancer in Hansberry's play should not be read as the embodiment of nationalism, but comes instead to represent the power of unspeakable past to spark political consciousness. Her dancing functions similarly to the cries heard in the play, expressing an imaginative possibility that bypasses the limitations of the colonizer's language to communicate the position and political vision of the colonized. In crucial turning points of Shinbei's character development, the dancer appears. She confronts him on stage with a nationalist history. In the final scene of Act 1, quote, she circles in movement symbolic of the life of the people, binding him closer. She signifies the slaughter, the enslavement. She drops and writhes in agony. She rises, a warrior, summoning him urgently, insistently, unrelentingly, end quote. With each movement, Shinbei responds with protest, but the woman will not relent. Even given her persistence, the play suggests Shinbei must act in order to align with the revolutionary collectivity she represents, placing him in relation to not only his father, but his brother Eric as well. Hansberry provides an answer to the problem of the individuality that plagues the historiography of the civil rights movement, most notably in the person of Martin Luther King Jr., through an aesthetic turn. She offers a transhistorical conception of the movement that links insurgent slaves fighting for freedom with civil rights activists, with post-colonial activists. In order to move something, you have to make it kinetic, which disrupts stasis. Whether the flow of history or the political tide, Hansberry's movement implicitly relies on physical movement, which takes an idealized form in dramatic performance. In the final scene, the woman not only serves as a signal of the insurgency to come, she also functions as a comfort to Shinbei, arriving in response to his animal-like cry of grief. As Hansberry suffered with her own mortality, she left as a part of her rich legacy a means of connection through performance. I have argued that the sounding produced in LeBlanc imagines an alternative representational field that disrupts the linguistic uniformity of colonial language and the pretending melange of the post-colonial nation-state. The cries serve to create a disruption that seeks to reinforce the freedom movements on the larger struggle for freedom and away from the immediate triumph of independent nation-states. The cries therefore have a temporal effect that works to leverage the time between revolution and national independence in the service of an insurgent imagination that accounts for and exceeds pragmatic concerns. Therefore, one might read Shinbei's cry as demonstrative of the work yet to be done in the political movement, work that will require new sounds as well as alternative modes of hearing. Yet to hear differently may require opening oneself up to modes of unreason that serve to distinguish the citizen from the insurgent. So as a coda, I would like to play Lauryn Hill's song Black Rage because as an artist and through her song, she calls for alternative modes of hearing the unreason of Black political subjectivity.
Beatings and beatings and suffering that worsens. Black human packages tied up in strings. Black rage can come from all these kinds of things. Black rage is founded on blatant denial, squeezed economics, subsistence survival, deafening silence and social control. Black rage is founded on wounds in the soul. When the dogs bite, when the beatings, when I'm feeling sad, I simply remember all these kinds of things, and then I don't feel so bad. progress of human contortion. Black rage is founded on these kinds of things. When the dogs bite, when the beatings, when I'm feeling sad, I simply remember all these kinds of things, and then I don't feel so bad. Weird surprises, it myth or illusion, forcing you back into perfect confusion, like human trafficking or blood transfusion. Black rage is founded on these kinds of things. Victims of violence, most likely embodied. Life out of context is living ungodly. Politics, breed falsely called well. Black rage is founded on denial of self. The dogs fight, knowing the beatings, when I'm feeling sad. I simply remember all these kinds of things, and then I don't feel so bad. So bad.
So, this song, Willard has been performing this song since 2012, but as some of you may know, she dedicated this song to the protesters in Ferguson in this last summer, in the summer of 2014. And so she makes a direct link between the activity or the protest in Ferguson and the song. But the other reason why I think it's useful in the context of what I'm trying to articulate in this talk is thinking about the alternative socialities, once again, that Hansberry's play and her work more broadly is calling for us to think through, particularly given how we might understand Hill's own self-representation in the media and in her music as being a mad woman or being crazy, and how she's been depicted as of late in the press, and then the lyrics of the song. So thank you.